Sri Aurobindo is having a last word after having commented on the Kena Upanishad. And in this case, what he has to say has three components. First, he summarizes the central teaching of the Kena Upanishad and the three assertions, the three states of existence on which it bases its entire teaching. What happens in the transition from the first state of being to the second state, how it is to be made, etc. In the summary of the content of the Kena. The second part of his last word is focusing on that thing which is perhaps incomplete or insufficient in the text of the Kena. And the third part is that element which is incomplete, now amplified, and the completion of it fully expressed. In this way, Sri Aurobindo, having faithfully followed the overall framework and teaching of the Kena, does not limit himself, and in a very objective and from a higher standpoint, is able to look at where it falls short. Having fully expressed the teaching of the Kena, he can still take a position that points out its limitation, and yet not lose sight of the larger body of the Upanishadic teaching in which this limitation must be seen. So we will briefly look at what it was that was covered so far. The teaching of the Kena rests on the three states of existence: the human and mortal, Brahman consciousness, which is the absolute of our relativities, and the utter absolute, which is unknowable. And our human experience is like a bright shadow of the Brahman consciousness, corresponding to each of our experiences of the mind, of the emotions, the life, the senses. Corresponding to each, there is a mind of Brahman, or a life of Brahman, or a sense of Brahman, which is true, complete, self-existent, of which our functioning mind, life, and senses are a limited, distorted, and pale reflection. And therefore, the goal of this whole life is to ascend from this lower existence into the higher existence. We have seen repeatedly in his commentary, he points out that this ascent is not an abandonment, because the definition of the higher life is the life of immortality, which is ascending out of sorrow and joy of the earth to a beatitude which transcends these limits and dualities. How this has to be done? By an abandonment of our attachment to the forms of things, by a progressive opening and stilling of our mind to the mind of Brahman, to be able to perceive the divine in all forms and to attach ourselves exclusively to the divine within all things. Such is the means that is used. But there is a double ascent. Not only our mind, life, and senses are rising, but also our consciousness, our soul, has also to rise. There is a double movement. Unlike the Vedantic teaching, which you will find as presently taught, which only concern themselves with our consciousness rising to become liberated, abandoning everything else. Even mind is seen as a trap, body as a prison, all of which are to be abandoned. Here, very distinctly, the mind ascending into a wider, diviner mind, life joining with the divine life, and even our physical senses joining with the divine working of the senses. Speech, which is the creative power, becomes now an expression of the divine creative power. And so these external changes are the awakening of the gods in the language of the Kena, and our own consciousness ascending is our individual liberation. The practical benefit you can see is not only we are liberated, but our means of experiencing the universe and Brahman is also liberated. The means then participate in the Brahman's experience of the universe. Meaning our mind now thinks, if we may use that term, the way Brahman thinks. Our senses perceive things the way Brahman sees them. And our life lives in the immortality and completeness of the Brahman experience. While all this is taking place in our experience of the world, we ourselves find ourselves united with the Brahman. This means practically that the teaching of the Kena is not leading us to an immersion in an isolation or an absolute in abandonment of the world. But there is clearly the sense of fulfillment in life. Sri Aurobindo takes pains to define the terms of this fulfillment. What we truly attained to the realization of the immortal existence that the Kena points to or leads us to. And we saw this passage last time. We have to perceive the universe in ourselves, that is, our own consciousness is so liberated that we are wider than the universe, and the universe is experienced as being a part of us. The extremities, so to say, or the limits of our consciousness have been dissolved and experience a transcendence even of space and time, and therefore can embrace and hold the universe within. The second aspect is he perceives also his self in all existences. So the one consciousness which is liberated is also now not only transcendent but immanent. We feel ourselves in all things. Every object or being that you meet, you feel it familiar because it is as if your own other part, your own other consciousness or form or body. And everything is felt as if intimately ourselves. And this is experienced in all things. So he perceives the universe in himself, he perceives also his self in all existences, and knows it to be the one, the omnipotent, the single, multiple, all-inhabiting Lord and reality. You see what you experience in all things and as yourself is the same one. It is the same omnipresent reality which is everywhere. It is not only in each one, not only in ourselves, it is equally in all things. It is one and yet it represents itself in a multiplicity. It is the Lord inhabiting all things, and it is the ultimate self-existent reality. Without this realization, he has not fulfilled the conditions of immortality. And the possession of this is described also by him. Therefore, it is said that what the sages seek is to distinguish and see the Brahman in all existences. By that discovery, realization and possession of him everywhere and in all, they attend to this immortal existence. And we saw this last time. Discovery may be temporary. It may be only a recognition that this is hiding behind and now you know it. But realization is when it is a permanent status, you see it and know it constantly. But there's a third degree, which is possession, where you are one with it intimately. It is not something that you have realized. You can say, for example, I've realized that life has a purpose. And when you say that, it means the sense of purpose is now permanent in you. But what that purpose is still not you. There's still a gap. And when that gap is filled, you are one with the purpose. I am the purpose of life. At that point, you have this possession of that purpose. So we must experience this divine in possession of Him everywhere through these three stages. And not only experience Him everywhere, but in all. And again, there's a fine distinction between these two experiences. There is the realization and possession of the divine everywhere as an immanent one reality, equally in all things. And then there is the perception of that and the possession of that in its uniqueness in each person, in each object, in each thing. And so both of these have to be realized. And then you see not only it is the same one everywhere, but you enjoy the way it works out in each form, in each being. And what is the purpose with which the divine manifests in that being? What is its line of exploration, development, and manifestation through that one individual form? And so in this experience, there is the fulfillment of the universal as well as the individual. And a very important idea here. There cannot be an individual fulfillment if there is not some deeper purpose to that birth or that soul, and a unique sense of purpose in each soul for each person. Now this is going to become extremely important in the very next paragraph, but right now we just keep it at the back of the mind. Only when you have this incompleteness that we can say you have attained to the immortal existence. Now Sri Aurobindo comes to the lack in the Kena text. Still, although the victory of the gods, that is to say the progressive perfection of the mind, life, body, in the positive terms of good, right, joy, knowledge, power, is recognized as a victory of the Brahman, and the necessity of using life and human works in the world as a means of preparation and self-mastery is admitted, yet a final passing away into the infinite heavenly world or status of Brahman consciousness is held out as the goal. And this comes repeatedly in the text when it says that not this which men chase after. Now we have seen repeatedly that can be seen also as a state, but there is still implied in one of the verses, this, after having said that if you do not attain that here on earth in the body, then great is the perdition. Still, there is the final statement which says, the wise distinguish that in all kinds of becomings, and they pass forward from this world and become immortal. And the suggestion of passing forward to become immortal, while still describing it as a state of consciousness, there is the sense of a passing away from something. And this is what is held out as the final goal or the highest goal in the teaching. At least that's the way the formulation is most obviously seen. Now this slant may be somewhat subtle, and yet it is there. And Sri Aurobindo addresses this. But first we see what he has said. What is it that the text has spoken of? In the mind, life and body becoming more and more perfect. It is the victory of the gods that the Kena is leading us to. That is, the cosmic powers working in our mind, life and body to develop them. The powers of evolution which are working in the entire cosmos, not just in our body, but in all forms and in all bodies. These cosmic powers or gods are working hard to push forward what? The good, the right, the joy, the knowledge, the power as their victory or as the victory of Brahman and as the evolutionary movement. Everywhere in the growth of evolution, you will see these things increasing. Goodness, rightness, joy, knowledge, and power. In the modern materialistic formulation of science of the last 200 years in Europe, you have the conventional idea of evolution and the driver of evolution as the survival of the fittest, highlighting only the aspect of growth of power. As things grow in evolution, they increase in power. An increase in power necessarily means an ability to influence environment and others. And this is seen as, therefore, a gigantic scramble in evolution, a gigantic battle and a destructive struggle in which the stronger destroys the weaker. Now, it made sense in the context of the thinking of the people in a very narrow materialistic science as it used to be 200 years ago, for a people who thought in terms of conquest only. But increasingly, as science has grown and has spread to a more refined form, even in the thought of humanity, when you look at nature, you find that this is not true. The evidence of nature does not fit this assumption of survival of the fittest. In nature, you find the most fragile, the most sensitive, the most tender and dependent, nourished by the strongest. A classic example is of the crocodile who opens its mouth to allow a tiny bird to step in and eat up all the food that is stuck between its teeth. If the bird does not enter it, the crocodile will find its teeth rotting after a while because of the food that is stuck. It cannot clean itself. It is dependent on the bird to clean its teeth. And the bird, on the other hand, is dependent on the crocodile to give to it these morsels of food, which are tiny morsels. And it can only be a tiny bird which can be satisfied with those morsels. It cannot hunt on its own. It's too weak, too dependent and fragile. The crocodile will open its mouth. The bird will safely, securely enter and eat this, pecking away. And when it flies away, the crocodile will close its mouth and rest. If by chance another bird enters the mouth of the crocodile, it will eat it immediately. What is the relationship between this bird and the crocodile? And this is just one example. There are numerous such examples in the workings of nature. If not for that, nothing which is fragile, gentle or sensitive would survive. And so what we see is nature and evolution's drivers are not merely power. What are they? There is also increase of knowledge, there is also increase of beauty, there is increase of joy, but there is also increase of goodness and rightness. All of these things, Sri Aurobindo lists, are the positive terms of evolution, which define the fullness of the evolutionary movement and the working of the gods and their victory. So you see in the teaching of the Kena, there is this enormous emphasis on the forward movement of evolution in all of human nature, mind, life, senses, etc. There is also in the same Kena, the necessity, the highlighting and the necessity of using life and human works in the world as the means of preparation and as the means of self-mastery. How do you grow? How do you develop in this evolution? How do you ascend in your consciousness? Well, the means is life and works in the world. So you can see clearly a positive emphasis here of life in the world. And yet there is this suggestion of a final passing away into a status of Brahman consciousness. That means you may as if living in a status of Brahman consciousness while your mind, life and body are still liberated and participating, but you are somehow in a final resting place in the Brahman consciousness. And Sri Aurobindo says, and this would seem to imply a rejection of the life of the cosmos. That is, although you have the complete life, still you choose to prefer living in that higher state and not in fulfilling the larger purpose. You can say, I'm liberated in consciousness. My life is liberated and a part of the cosmic life and so on. But then what do you do with that? Well, you remain in that enjoyment and the beatitude with your liberated life and consciousness, and with your mind, which is part of cosmic mind. So this implication of a rejection of life of the cosmos. It's a very subtle tilt, but it's there, and Sri Aurobindo points to this as a limitation, as a flaw. Well then, may we ask, We, the modern humanity, more and more conscious of the inner warning of that which created us, be it nature or God, that there is a work for the race, a divine purpose in its creation which exceeds the salvation of the individual soul. Because the universal is as real or even more real than the individual. We who feel more and more in the language of the Quran that the Lord did not create heaven and earth in a jest, that Brahman did not begin dreaming this world dream in a moment of aberration and delirium. Well, may we ask whether this gospel of individual salvation is all the message even of this purer, earlier, more Catholic Vedanta? If so, then Vedanta at its best is a gospel for the saint, the ascetic, the monk, the solitary. But it has not a message which the widening consciousness of the world can joyfully accept as the word for which it was waiting. For there is evidently something vital that has escaped it, a profound word of the riddle of existence from which it has turned its eyes, or which it was unable or thought it not worthwhile to solve. Now it's 3 sentences, I have read the whole thing, you get the gist of what he is talking about. If this is true, that the Kena, even as being one of the earliest Upanishads, has this turning away from life as its highest purpose of the individual liberation, then it's missing something important. What is that something important, and why does it become important? And Sri Aurobindo here is not resting on scripture for validation. He looks at what has changed in humanity. And this is our biggest indicator. Humanity today is dissatisfied with the liberation of an individual freedom. It is dissatisfied with the withdrawal from the world. It feels deeply, intuitively, and not just in a few individuals, in the consciousness of the race, that there is a divine purpose in this creation, which is more than the freedom of the individual. And this is something Sri Aurobindo points to. Now, in stating this, Sri Aurobindo is breaking away from reliance on any text, including the Kena. He is pointing to something which is true, and it is true for all of us to introspect or observe externally, objectively. And you find, yes, this has been happening, and particularly in the last 200 or 300 years, all over the world. Increasingly, definitely in the last 100 years. And this change taking place can be understood in a still larger body of teaching, which looks at the cycles through which humanity evolves. And there we see, yes, there is also a rationale to this transition. But what is this transition? And what is it that the Kena text falls short of? Let's read the text in detail now. He says, we, the modern humanity, more and more conscious of the inner warning of that which created us, that there is a work for the race. And he says, without getting into details of what created us, perhaps nature created us, if you're a reductionist scientist, or God created us, or if according to the religion also you may say there is only this compulsion of nature. Whatever created is not important. But there is the inner warning of that which created us, warning us that there is a work for the race, a divine purpose. Now look at what has happened in the last last century or so. Somewhere inside, wherever there were tendencies for an ascetic withdrawal, you find a reaction in the heart of people saying, no, this is not good enough. While earlier, the teachings 200 or 300 years ago even might have been, when you see the suffering in the world, well, find your own salvation, find your own freedom, look at it in a detached way, stand back, don't be disturbed. The reality is there. This is a world of suffering, you can do nothing. And for quite a while, going back almost 2000 years, humanity was seduced by this ideal. It was so compelling that in any discourse, in any philosophical argument, this ideal would win the argument. If there was a collision of two perspectives, one saying, no, you have to fulfill in life, and the other saying, the world cannot fulfill a higher, diviner life, you have to withdraw and accept its limitation. When you spoke of withdrawal, the power of that thought was so compelling, everybody would say, yes, this satisfies me. Now there's a very deep idea here. Truth of both. Finally, the test is not what logic taught you, it's what your heart was drawn to. Listening to that teaching, your heart says, yes, I feel this attractive. And that would be the mood of the age. People would find themselves turning to us because it drew them. Now in the last 100 years, this mood has changed. Over the last 300 years, let's say, that mood faded and a new mood filled in, and there has been a transition most obviously seen in the last 100 years. The most ascetic traditions are turning back to life. And if for any reason they choose not to turn back to life, you will find life withdrawing from them. I was speaking to a senior monk of a very well-known monastic tradition in India, highly respected. And what he shared was, and he joined it now almost 55 years ago, about. He joined it as a young man at the age of about 20 or so. And now in his 70s, he says, everywhere in all their centers, in all their monasteries, the number of people joining has dropped. People still come to listen to lectures, but number of people applying to become monks, where earlier per month they would have about 50 to 100 people applying. This has dropped rapidly. In a year it used to be 50 to 100, and this has further dropped. They get barely 4 to 10 per year. And this is a global, across the world phenomenon. And yet more and more people are coming for the teaching, for what they can imbibe, for how it can change their lives. This you see as an obvious form. Similarly, in the most isolated communities of religions, the Tibetan monasteries, for example, which refused even to meet people coming from outside. Literally, life drove in and pushed it out, and the teaching spread out all over the world. The same monastics who remained in bare self-denial are now engaged in going out all over the world to preach the teachings and the practical use of the Buddhist practices, which can help to lead to silence of mind or freedom from suffering or whatever it is that people seek. The application of the meditation techniques, whether from Vedanta or Buddhism, have become now so common that in many schools in the US, they are teaching mindfulness practice to children at the age 5 to 10. And they have to use mindfulness practice because the formulation, the wording, gets you free of any religious connotation. You cannot speak of meditation because that has a religious connotation. But mindfulness, it's mind, it's fine. So the practice is accepted. Why? You see, in all corporate programs of the world, there'll be certain practices relating to meditation, certain practices relating to changing consciousness, certain practices to develop deeper equality, etc. Turning to texts such as Bhagavad Gita, which are the most intense in their acceptance of life and even participation in the war of life, in the battle. Such a text now becomes a reference point for teachings of modern management. Sometimes modified, sometimes filtered for vocabulary. But still, the turning of humanity is to this recognition that I'm not satisfied in withdrawal. There is something that needs to be done. And now you look back at the last 20 years, this need has become so vivid, so intense. Everybody feels in their heart a restlessness, as if there is something to be done, but I don't know what there is, but there's an urgency. That's all. Because of that restlessness and the sense of urgency, you start trying out different things. The dissatisfaction of each of these things drives you further to look for something else. You're looking for something, and you don't know what you're looking for, but when you do touch it, even partially, there is a kind of a deep calm or satisfaction, a sense of a subtle nourishment, and you say, this is satisfying, I want more of this. I was recently in a gathering of people from the Middle East who are activists working for climate change and protection of the environment. Many of them coming from very strong and rigid religious practices. And it was interesting to hear from them how they were turning to certain videos, lectures of Vedantic teachings or Buddhist teachings because it gave them the nourishment that they were seeking for their spiritual needs. And it was not a rejection of their own tradition, it was more something missing which they found here, but they were happy to embrace whatever was nourishing. This particular shift of an acceptance of something which is subjectively fit, which may make no sense rationally, is also the characteristic of the shift of the age into what Sri Aurobindo calls the subjective age. From the hard, rigid, rational age, which had a strong individualism, there is a transition to a subjective age and an attempt to reach out to humanity as your larger identity. And Sri Aurobindo uses this phrase, very prophetic, 100 years ago he wrote, of the turn towards the religion of humanity, where you transcend the narrow religious distinctions and teachings and recognize that your service to humanity is your religion and find in it a universality in which all the religions have to open to. And they have to open to or they become irrelevant and die out. In the churches, similarly, all over the world, the number of people joining to become ascetics or monks or nuns has dropped so drastically that they often cannot run their properties and they sell away churches, which are then bought up by the new movements which are not ascetic or which are not withdrawing from life. And so you will find many Vedantic teaching centers in what were earlier former churches in Europe or the US. But this withdrawal again of people has made the church recognize that their teaching was not meeting the youth. And so they're going through a deep introspection. They came up with new catechisms or teachings which were more accessible and acceptable to humanity. But what you see there is religious figures and heads and institutions trying to catch up with the change taking place in humanity. They are not drivers of the change. How did this change take place? Looking at the big picture of the cycles, we see how from the golden age there is the passage through the age of silver and then the bronze and then the iron age. Basically, Sri Aurobindo observes in the golden age the truth spontaneously expresses itself, but after a while there's a gap and the truth is held by force of will. This becomes the character of the second age. And when the will breaks down, the third phase is when the truth is held by structures and systems which compel and try to give form to the truth and bind it in form. And eventually the forms suffocate, and when they break down, this third age gives way to the fourth, the Kali Yuga, where the forms become insufficient, experimented with by change of form until all changes fail. And at that point, the consciousness turns to look for the truth behind the forms. And there is the entry into the subjective age. If it does not stop short with the false subjectivism of the satisfaction of ego and desire, which it can, if it does not fall short, it will go deeper into a spiritual subjectivism, a satisfaction of the soul, which will build the new spiritual age. And it is this which we are seeing now. And Sri Aurobindo is describing this in a very interesting way. We, the modern humanity, more and more conscious of the inner warning of that which created us, that there is a work for the race. Meaning, he's telling you what it is that is pushing this restlessness and a need. It is as if the divine which has formed you, or the nature which has formed you, whichever way you look at it, either the soul or the deeper workings of nature within you, are warning you that there is a work to be done for the race. And you cannot sit back. You have to do this. And it is for the race. It's not just for you and I. It's not just for a small collective. It is for the race in which you and I and the small collectives we live in have also their role to play. A divine purpose in its creation which exceeds the salvation of the individual soul. Yes, we have to awaken. We have to liberate our consciousness, etc. But there is a work to be done on the larger scale which is more important even than this liberation. And you see the nature of the transition today. You cannot say, I will withdraw until I have the necessary power and liberation for me to be able to participate in this new awakening. You don't have the time. You will not survive as a race if you do not work at the same time in external activism. So this was the nature, in fact, of one of the programs that I was participating in barely a week ago, in what I described as these climate change activists. They're all involved in saving, protecting, or working for the earth and the environment. But the discussion was going to the inner dimensions of climate change. What are the deeper psycho-spiritual causes which have brought us to this crisis, and what do we need to do internally so that our external work may be more complete and more effective. And this is the nature of the crisis. You cannot ignore this divine purpose in the creation of the race in favor of the soul. And what is the logic behind? Because the universe is as real or even more real than the individual. First, it is as real. The individual cannot exist without the universe. Universe is not fulfilled without the individual. It would just be a barren, empty landscape. But then he says universe is more real. Why? Because the individual could be extinguished. The universe would still continue. The universe would produce a new individual, as it has done so many times in the past. And so the universe is more real, and something collective which is to be realized in the universe makes your individual life worthwhile. Rather, your individual life serves to fulfill in the universe a purpose which is greater than your individual life, but for which your individual life was necessary. And this is the shift in our deeper sense, mindset, or mood of the age. We who feel more and more, you see, this is pointing, and this is written 100 years ago. A part of humanity which feels more and more, except now that part has become pretty much the dominant majority. We who feel more and more. And now he uses language. He says, in the language of the Quran, this is one of the very few references we find to a text from the Quran itself, that the Lord did not create heaven and earth in a jest. And then he shifts to the same idea from the Vedantic perspective, that Brahman did not begin dreaming this world dream in a moment of aberration and delirium. So the text in the Quran is interesting. It appears in slightly different ways several times, but two occasions which is most close to what Sri Aurobindo has put. This is from the Quran, chapter 44, verse 38-39. We did not create the heavens and earths, and that between them in play. This is one of the translations. It will be the Arabic word which will be play or jest or lightness or vain. And second verse, we did not create them except in truth, but most of them do not know. Them meaning humanity. The we is also suggestive. God does not say I, it says we. And the creative movement has a double aspect of which in the Quran is implied but not stated explicitly. Which in the Vedantic tradition takes the form of the Lord and the divine Shakti, the power of the Lord. There's another verse which is chapter 3 and 191. No, sorry, there's another. This is verse 46, chapter 46 and verse 3. It is for a true purpose and a specific term that we created heaven and earth and everything in between. Yet those who deny the truth ignore the warning they have been given. It's interesting, the suggestion of the warning. There is a true purpose and a specific term that we created heaven and earth and everything in between. For a true purpose. And there's a warning given. And that's why Sri Aurobindo quotes from the Quran the sense of the warning from the Creator that time is short and there is an urgency for this. That Brahman didn't begin dreaming this world dream in a moment of aberration and delirium. And in such a mood of the age, he says, we may ask whether this gospel of individual salvation is all the message of even this purer, earlier, more Catholic Vedanta. So Sri Aurobindo always distinguishes between the earlier Vedanta and the later Vedanta. Later Vedanta, as we have it today, is life renouncing, looks at the world as illusion and a domain of suffering from which to withdraw. The earlier Vedanta is close to the Veda, which is life accepting, life embracing, life transforming, life divinizing, fulfilling and manifesting the divine in the world. And so the closer you get to the Veda, and the closest being the Isha Upanishad, the closer you find this being the theme of the text, the farther away you get in time, you find it drifting towards this individual focus and liberation. This is what he says. Even here in this purer, more Catholic Vedanta and earlier Vedanta, you find this slant, but it's a slant only. If so, then Vedanta at its best is a gospel for the saint, the ascetic, the monk, the solitary. Because only for an individual withdrawing will it become relevant. But it has not a message which the widening consciousness of the world can joyfully accept as the word for which it was waiting. This phrase is very important. You notice in the consciousness of humanity, there is this widening taking place. Most vividly felt, let's say, in the last 20 years, after the emergence of the internet as a vehicle in which the wideness could express itself. The sense of the wideness had already begun. And we can see how even before the internet, the teachings had taken the form, think global, act local. But with the internet, every individual is now able to participate and give expression to this wideness. I have, through a single mobile phone in my hand, connection instantaneously to a group of friends across the world. And in my consciousness, something actually reaches out and stays in closeness to them through that constant interaction. Practically, it means in the individual consciousness, a part has now got spontaneously, effortlessly, the wideness that it can embrace all humanity. This is so important, because if the consciousness is not sufficiently widened, even if unconsciously, we would not feel that embracement and we would not be able to express it therefore in our actions. We would need to go through a process, through education or otherwise, to develop this embracement. And right now it's happening almost by compulsion, inevitably, because of the means which is being offered for its constant expression in life. If nothing else, through the telephone. And so, in this widening consciousness of the world, and remember Sri Aurobindo is describing this 100 years ago when the widening had barely begun. Its early form was people thinking of the rest of the world as something to be conquered or something to be used. And the whole colonial phase is really an expression of that. Conquer the others for your benefit. It was still an attempt to widen at a very crude level. But here is this deeper widening of consciousness, which has already begun. And in this widening consciousness, there is a sense of, I need a guidance, I need a reference, I need something which will help me move forward, against which I can refer all my confused life experiences or compulsions. Because another character of the world today is also that we are pulled in so many more directions. Earlier, in living in a village, you had your little house and your little life, and every once in a while you would get a letter or some visitor would come after having traveled for weeks or months. You could write a letter in a beautiful handwriting, spending an hour on it, because the letter would take 6 months to go to the other side of the world, or for the answer to come back at least. So it made sense. But now when the letter goes instantaneously, you don't want to spend more than 30 seconds to write it. All of this has led to a sense of confusion because so many pulls are there equally and demanding urgently. And how do I navigate through these pulls? I don't have a reference point. At the moment that this person calls me, it seems the most important, but the next moment the other person stands before me and this seems more important, or that problem is most urgent. There's a phrase which Panditji quoted from somewhere. He said, urgent shuts out the important. You go back barely 50 years ago, you could spend time on what is important. Today, because of this demand, answer in the next half hour. You need to do this in the next 1 day. If you don't fill out this form within the next 1 week, well, you will lose all this. The urgency has become so compelling that you have to put aside what is important. And here comes the conflict then. What do you do? Where do you compromise? Because every step is a compromise. What's your reference? And so the message which we are looking for, the word for which it was waiting. And it seems as if the Veda or the Vedanta gives you that solution, or the Gita. But if its highest ideal is this turning to an individual salvation, then this cannot be it either. For there is evidently something vital that has escaped it. A profound word of the riddle of existence from which it has turned its eyes, or which it was unable to solve or thought it not worthwhile to solve. Meaning now there's a riddle of our existence which is still waiting to be solved, which has not been resolved yet by this teaching, even though it has given you so much. And Sri Aurobindo has an entire series of articles coming out in a booklet that is titled The Riddle of This World, where he places the framework of this problem of existence and leads you through to a solution. But this riddle of the world, the riddle being, although in order to be able to truly enjoy the world, you have as if to disengage from the world, and yet having disengaged from the world and having found your freedom in a higher consciousness, you're required now to re-engage with the world, because the world will not let you remain detached from it. So the solution which the Bhagavad Gita offers is precisely to enter a liberated consciousness, but then from that liberation to re-embrace the life and the world and fulfill the purpose of that consciousness in life. And even there, in the highest formulation of its fulfillment, it can only go so far as to say, for the service of humanity. And it stops there. Because it was still at a passage where it was premature to speak of something more. That something more we find in the Veda, articulated, obviously, directly, and yet in a language which, being symbolic, allows multiple expressions or interpretations. So people can draw from the Veda what they want, But they miss the point if they do not see that the whole thrust of the Veda is a joyous, fulfilling participation in the world as, to use a modern vocabulary, co-creators. Meaning, in our liberated consciousness, we are one with the Creator, and now in our re-engagement with the world, we are creators, co-creators, equally creators among each other, participating in the divine creation, fulfilling the divine delight in creation. In other words, manifesting increasingly all the riches which is waiting from above to be yet manifested. No more through the slow evolution, but now through the direct expression of conscious individuals participating, not separately in each, but in a collective expression, all together formulating, manifesting something which is not possible in their individual expression. And this gives you a sense of where the whole thing is going. And this is the direction of the solution to this riddle of the existence, which in the Veda is dealt with. But the key to the Veda itself was lost. The Upanishads being more philosophically and mentally accessible, as they descend from the Vedic intuitive consciousness, they become more accessible to the reasoning mind and the intellect of humanity. So humanity stops there, cannot access the Veda anymore. But you go to the earlier Upanishads and the later Upanishads, you see a slope. And he explains this now. Now certainly there is an emphasis in the Upanishads, increasing steadily as time goes on into an overemphasis on the salvation of the individual, on his rejection of the lower cosmic life. This note increases in them as they become later in date. It swells afterwards into the rejection of all cosmic life, whatever. And that becomes finally, in later Hinduism, almost the one dominant and all-challenging cry. That's how you see many of the ascetic traditions as they are today. It does not exist in the earlier Vedic revelation, where individual salvation is regarded as a means towards a great cosmic victory. The eventual conquest of heaven and earth by the superconscient truth and bliss. And those who have achieved the victory in the past are the conscious helpers of their yet battling posterity. So the whole theme of the Veda is this, that we become part of this cosmic struggle or battle between the divine evolutionary forces and the anti-divine involutionary forces. But the conquest is by the truth and the bliss which have to manifest. And those who have achieved it, that is the Vedic rishis, have already achieved it, and they are now participating in that work, helping us who are following after them. And now the picture is totally different. It's no more we alone struggling to withdraw and find some liberation and fulfillment beyond. It is right now a massive downward movement of the divine power, of the divine truth and the divine bliss, working through individuals who have already realized that to assist the rest of humanity in this awakening, to bring that down to earth. In Savitri, to bring God down to the earth, on earth we came, to make the earthly life the life divine. And they are still battling for us, with us. So if this earlier note is missing in the Upanishads, then in using them as an aid of knowledge, we must insistently call back that earlier missing note. We must seek elsewhere a solution for the word of the riddle that has been ignored. So that point which is missing here, we have to get back from whatever the source, which was there before. And then there's a whole parenthetical statement in between, where he is highlighting that in this movement we are not rejecting what the Upanishad gives us. For great as are these scriptures, luminous, profound, sublime in their unsurpassed truth, beauty, and power. Yet it is only the ignorant soul that will make itself the slave of a book. Such a powerful statement, pointing out the greatness of the text of the Upanishads or the other scriptures, however great they may be. Luminous, profound, sublime in their unsurpassed truth, beauty, and power. And yet, a book is only a formulation of the experience. This is the problem that we face when we deal with many of the more rigid formulations of religions, where when in conflict or when in difficulty they turn to the book, and the book then undergoes necessarily an interpretation because language has changed, the vocabulary has modified, the way we understand ideas or words has changed. And in any case, the experience of the founder of the religion always exceeds formulation in a book. If it could be captured into a book, then the book would be enough to give you the experience instantaneously, having read it. Precisely in the very formulation in words, we are dimming the experience and fitting it into a vehicle which cannot contain the experience but only the idea of the experience. So you're able to reduce the experience to a series of ideas, at best with a kind of a light or power filling those ideas, but still only faintly. And that's all you can do with a book. It's a whole different story that if the living person with the living experience can meet the disciple, he can imprint the experience directly because it's a living force. But of course, the disciple should be able to receive or contain what is imprinted, and that becomes another story. And so what you see often in a religion is immediately around the founder or the realized being, a number of disciples who attain to extraordinary greatness. And then successively over time, a dimming of the experience, until finally people fall back only on the book. Fortunately, there are higher powers which help, and every now and then there will be a great saint or sage who enters the religion, rebuilds or recovers something of that original experience, or adds to it a dimension which was missing, and lifts the whole religious energy to a higher stage, and again gradual diminution, and again a raising and widening and a diminution. In practice, this takes the form of the religions becoming divided, or schools or lines of teaching or experience breaking apart, separating, catching certain aspects or widening or narrowing as necessary, the whole being more complete than the specialized forms. All of this is still the point that the book cannot hold. And so we don't limit ourselves to this formulation, however great it is. And we have to go back to the solution. The Upanishad alone of extant scriptures gives us without veil or stinting, with plenitude and noble Catholicity, the truth of the Brahman. And therefore we have to recognize this. Its aid to humanity is therefore indispensable. You need this, there is no doubt about it. Only where anything essential is missing, we must go beyond the Upanishads to seek it. As for instance, when we add to its emphasis on divine knowledge, the indispensable ardent emphasis of the later teachings upon divine love, and the high emphasis of the Veda upon divine works. Now you see, practically almost all the Upanishad texts tend to slant towards the knowledge aspect, and the divine liberating knowledge is their primary means. And he says we have to add the two other emphasis. From the Veda you have the emphasis upon divine works, because it is in a life, in action, that we manifest the divine and even develop our ascent, our rise to the divine consciousness. And the other, which is very interesting, the later teachings, the emphasis of the later teachings upon divine love. Now what comes after the Veda and the Upanishads, which was not there in the Veda and the Upanishads? And this you find in the Bhagavad Gita, where Shri Krishna brings forward the path of the divine love, the Bhakti Marga. The Veda has prayer, has the movement of self-giving, consecration, but not explicitly the joyous, loving self-giving of the heart. It is implied because it speaks of the bliss, it speaks of the ananda, it speaks of the delight, the sap of delight in all things. But the turning of the emotions in joy in order to approach that delight through the heart is not obvious, although implied. Similarly, in the Upanishads, you will find this implied in some, not all, but not explicit and not given the emphasis necessary. And that's why the Bhagavad Gita comes to unify these three paths, the triple paths of works, of knowledge, and of love and devotion. And in the way Sri Krishna articulates it, he says, the highest is the way through the heart. Not meaning as a separate way, but when the three merge, the fulfillment that is highest reached is when the heart joins in the delightful union with the divine. You will see in Sri Aurobindo's formulation of these three paths, when he widens the three paths to make them integral, in the synthesis of yoga, he places the three footings, so to say, of the yoga of self-perfection on the yoga of works, yoga of knowledge, yoga of love. But he widens the definition of all three to make them sufficient containers on which the full yoga of self-perfection and the supramental yoga of transformation can be built. And so when he takes the yoga of works, he makes it as wide as possible. And then when he takes after that the yoga of knowledge, he shows how it goes further than the yoga of works in what it can realize. And then when he takes up the yoga of love, it goes even further than the yoga of knowledge, while including the benefits of both. And we see the three complementing each other and finding a most complete fulfillment in the heart's union with the full knowledge and the full action all joined. And so Sri Aurobindo is pointing to these three needing equal emphasis. And if the Kena Upanishad lacks, we have to accept the Kena because it is a necessary foundation. But we recognize these two essential components and find their fulfillment. And this is why Sri Aurobindo takes pains for this last word. He spends the next two pages of the chapter to discuss how this unification is to take place and what this represents, even in the perspective coming from various traditions which are existent. And we see their resolution, which makes for the full complete benefit of our study of the Kena. And so we will take up this part on Sunday. For now, we simply recognize and review this important idea. What is it that the Kena gives which is essential? The Upanishad alone of all existent scriptures gives us without veil or stinting, without putting any barrier or without holding back anything. It gives you the full knowledge, the full imprint of the experience. With plenitude, there is always the fullness, it's not a partial. And a noble Catholicity, there's no mixture, it is pure focus on the truths of the Brahman. That's what it gives you. Brahman is unveiled, Brahman is not held back, the fullness of Brahman brought in its purity, and the truth of the Brahman is given. Its aid to humanity is therefore indispensable. Only where anything essential is missing, we go beyond the Upanishads to seek it. As for instance, when we add to its emphasis on divine knowledge, the indispensable ardent emphasis of the later teachings upon divine love, and the high emphasis of the Veda upon divine works. So divine knowledge, divine love, divine works, these three are going to be our practice, even as we take the support of the Kena in the realization of the Brahman. We can meditate on this for a few minutes.